Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please take your seats. I almost started with this is Tuesday evening and this is a regularly scheduled, but I digress. My name is Brooke Lipsett and I am very happy to be here with you tonight celebrating the peace movement and the civil rights movement here in Newton. We are, all of us, grateful to Newton 2000 and the Mayor's Office of Cultural Affairs, which have hosted this evening and which have produced the books, which are available, will be available to you at the end of the evening for purchase. And this evening we will be hearing from some of the people who were involved in the writing and production of these two wonderful books, one on the history of the civil rights movement and one on the history of the peace movement in this city. And let me only take 1 second to introduce one of my colleagues, because I am always so grateful when my colleagues on the Board of Aldermen add to their already busy schedules and come out to community meetings. In the rear of the room on the right, I see Alderman Carlton Merrill, and I thank you, Carlton, for being here with us this evening.
Thank you.
We're going to start this evening with the authors of the book on the peace movement in Newton. And first, I would like to call on Louise Lown. Louise is going to talk to us about the history of the voice of women in Newton. Louise Lown.
The voice of women was an extraordinary phenomenon. In 1961, a few women, lacking both political or organizing skills.
Use the mic, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. In 1961, a few women, lacking both political and organizing skills, formed a movement which made a difference. On reflecting about that period, it evokes the dread we then felt and pride at what we achieved. It was an age of wrenching anxiety. Arsenals of nuclear overkill equaled more than 1 million Hiroshimas. We hovered on the brink of extinction. There was no place to hide. We could not assure our children that they would grow up or even survive. The Cuban Missile Crisis galvanized our activity. Our constituency stemmed from Newton and the western suburbs, never more than 50 women. Because of our small numbers, we frequently formed coalitions. We engaged in diverse activities. Our primary aim was to educate the widest public. We held meetings, issued newsletters, stuffed envelopes, and drew colorful posters, most of which were the work of our artist in residence, Alice Arenal. We helped political candidates who supported our peace mission. We started a peace boutique as a meeting place to exchange ideas and to raise funds, always in short supply. Some of us, some of us were jailed actually for civil disobedience. Our social activism extended beyond peace issues. We were involved in the civil rights struggle then raging in America. We passionately opposed the mindless and evil war in Vietnam. One of our members, Louise, was so enraged that she put on a backpack and walked to Washington, preaching, haranguing, proselytizing all the way. 2 weeks ago, I was participating at the weekly vigil at Newton Center against the impending war in Iraq, organized by the Newton Group Dialogue for Peace and War. I was standing next to a young BC student who joined in the protest. Offhandedly, I mentioned that about 42 years ago, I was also demonstrating for peace. He looked at me as though he had met his first Neanderthal woman. The work of Voice of Women was not in the mainstream. We were a small minority. We faced opposition, ridicule, and unpleasant confrontations. There were many residents who had a different point of view. Still, we garnered much support from mayors, aldermen, state reps, and senators, whom we badgered about peace issues. In 1965, our state representative, Irving Fishman, introduced a resolution in the state for a ceasefire in Vietnam. In 1970, Representative Jim Shea, a former alderman, introduced a bill in the state declaring it unconstitutional to draft Massachusetts residents when there was no formal declaration of war. Senator Jack Bachman supported this bill, which passed and was signed by Governor Sargent. Mayor Theodore Mann declared Newton as a nuclear-free zone. He pushed through a resolution at the National Mayors Conference to urge a comprehensive test ban. Our mayor, David Cohen, has been a strong supporter. He stimulated the Board of Aldermen to vote for a resolution on the November ballot in '99. It urges the President of the United States to negotiate a nuclear weapons convention for a phased elimination of these genocidal weapons. The 2020 group was the catalyst for this action. About 3 years ago, in preparation for Newton 2000, a history committee was organized by Jean Husher to document significant Newton events in the last century. I was asked to participate in this effort. Together with other women who had been active in Voice of Women, we decided to focus on the peace movement mainly during the 60s. As we were digging into our files, we realized that we were researching a significant bit of history. I was eager to be involved once again, for now we were memorializing those marvelous women who never lacked time nor energy. As we are moving toward a war with Iraq, such groups become urgently needed. Voice of Women taught me an old lesson, that a small group can make a big difference. As Margaret Mead stated, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
Do you need to do something with your mouth? Good. Thank you so much, Louise. And Louise has referred, as I did earlier, to the book that was researched for the history of the peace movement here in Newton, and to talk to us a little bit about the search for the records, we have Rohna Shoul.
At the end of the Vietnam War, Voice of Women disbanded. We understood the historical significance of our activities. In 1973, the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, which specializes in women's history, expressed an interest in creating an archive with our papers. It didn't happen until 1992, after our 30th reunion. Most of our papers were stored in my garage, in cardboard cartons, on the floor. And 1 year later, we had a major flood in our garage. And this is a cautionary tale to all of you who have documents, which may be research material for historians. Don't let them mold in a damp basement or gather dust in your attics. Bring them into the Newton Library for evaluation. Not all of them, just families. For appropriate depositories. Well, to write this history, we pooled our memories, and fortunately, most of us were alive at that point. Several have died since. We checked our archives, we researched history, and we read the very few books, probably 3, that were written about the women's peace movement in the 60s and 70s. When Suzanne McCormick, a doctoral candidate in history at Boston College, was looking for material about the role of women activists during the Vietnam War, she went to the Schlesinger and found our archives. And these were used for her thesis. Quote, "Good politics is doing something. Independent diplomats and anti-war activists in the Vietnam-era peace movement, a collective biography." A very valuable resource is the Newton Times microfiche collection, which is available right here in the library. It was published from 1970 to 1980, and I'm sure as I look out here, I'm sure most of you probably remember it. And it covered the major issues that roiled this community. Its editor, Harriet Avery, created a real community newspaper from a group of mostly women who are long on enthusiasm and very short in experience. And some have gone on in the field of journalism, but all of us were changed by having this unique opportunity. The photo collection in the Newton Room is invaluable and provided us with many of the photographs in our history. Beth Ansell, the photographer for the Times, was inadvertently left out of the acknowledgments, so I'm putting her in right now. We also failed to recognize Bobby Kravitz, who took over from Harriet Avery in 1977 and kept the Newton Times afloat until it became financially impossible, and that's when the tab came in. We also failed to acknowledge Anita Greenbaum, our super activist, who was arrested more times than anyone else. She's here. The writing of the history could have ended here, and that would have been fine. But it hasn't. We now have a video project. And we have taken 15 women who were very active in Voice of Women, and there are at least 15 more, and even more than that, who should be taped. And Ann Smith, who's right over there, who's our personal videographer, is taping this event, and which will be incorporated into a documentary, along with segments from the interviews, posters created by our resident graphic artist, Alice Aronow. And although we had a grant from a small foundation and the Newton Cultural Affairs Committee, this project would not have happened without the generosity of Anne, whose company is Relatively Speaking, and I hope there are brochures at that. The women's peace movement of the 1960s and 70s is mostly a historical memory. This includes Women's Strike for Peace, Women for Peace, Voice of Women USA. Voice of Women Canada still functions, however, but Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, founded in 1919, is alive and well, and continues the work of the founders, Jane Addams and Emily Balch, both of whom received the Nobel Peace Prize. And Newton resident Joan Eckline still keeps it going. We have had many heroines in the women's peace movement, and one of my favorites is Bella Abzug, which I think many of you will remember. One of the founders of Women's Strike for Peace, and one of the things she said was, quote, "Our call is to stop nuclear pollution. Our call is to build real democracies, not hypocrisies. Our call is to nurture and strengthen all families. Our call is to build communities, not only markets. And our call is to scale the Great Wall around women everywhere."
Thank you, Rohna. And as I look around the room this evening and I listen to the remarks, I realize how many of the people referred to in these brochures and in the remarks are here in the room, and we reluctant to begin introducing you because I know I'm going to miss some of you, but I hope that when we have an opportunity later to speak with each other, that some of you will get a chance to address us. Finally, the final author of the Peace Movement in Newton booklet that is here this evening is Kay Stein, and she is going to talk to us about what was really a very significant part of the peace movement here in Newton, and that was working with people outside of Newton and even outside of our country. Kay Stein.
That's probably still the right Voice of Women ignored the Cold War rhetoric and barriers and reached out to women in the Soviet Union who shared similar anxieties as mothers. In September of 1966, I was chairwoman of Voice of Women of Newton and of New England, and was invited with 4 other women to visit the Soviet Union under the auspices of the Soviet Women's Friendship Society. Our member was Louise Lown. Visiting the cities of Moscow, Leningrad, and Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, we met with women to discuss ending the war in Vietnam, as well as to exchange points of view. In Estonia, I had the opportunity to explain on radio the American women's peace movement. In return, the Newton Voice of Women hosted a group of Soviet women when they came to Boston. Another exciting visit was the International Voice of Women meeting that Rohna Shoul and I made to Montreal. Here, Eleni Kazantzaki was a main speaker, and Eleni and I became close friends and had a 25-year correspondence, which is now in the New Hellenic Museum in Chicago. She also went on a trip to Greece and Turkey, hoping that she would find her father's burial, but was unsuccessful. She, as you probably know, is the widow of Nikos Kazantzaki, best known as the author of Zorba the Greek. I made a resolution to rid Greece of the junta on the evening before, and that is how we became very close friends. She was unable to find her father's burial, unfortunately, but she was very happy to find that many of her husband's books were in Turkey, in all the bookstores, which made her very happy. So anyway, that was my experience, and it was very exciting.
Thank you so much, Kay. Wonderful hearing about the all the wonderful people everybody got to meet during these exciting times. The peace movement, as we all are much too much aware today, is not just a thing of the past. It's something that continues to have a life. And I'd like to take a few minutes to have us talk about the passing of the torch for the peace movement. And to address that issue, I'd like to call on Beverly Rose.
Thank you and good evening. And before I talk about passing the torch, I just can't help but take a moment to thank women and people like Kay and Louise and Rohna and so many more who have laid the foundation for our work that we have continued to do over the last decades. They were there early on. Without them, we wouldn't have probably done our work. So thank you, and we honor you. My name's Bev Drive, and I was the founder or co-founder of Newton Action for Nuclear Disarmament in 1980. I'll try to be very brief and not dwell too much on the history because I'd really like to talk about some actions you can take today. NAND was basically founded because Dr. Helen Caldecott, and I'm sure many in the audience know her, came to town and actually lived in Newton with her husband Bill, who was the founder of Beyond War. And she spoke at length about, it's time to stop focusing on our little circles, but the world at large. So in 1981, we, a few of us, 6 of us, organized the Mother's Day Rally for Peace in the Boston Common to coincide with her national march in Washington. And we had about 500 people attend, whoopee-doo. By 1982, when we had our second annual Mother's Day Rally on the Boston Common, we had over 5,000 people attend. So we were experiencing a lot of growth. Part of that was because President Reagan was elected and he was building the military budget, and we were advocating for, obviously you have to have a military budget, but please let's be sure to fund environmental and human needs. So NAND grew from a paid membership of 6 people to over 500 people within just a few years, a $15,000 budget, an office, a paid staff person, and we were even infiltrated by the CIA. Brooke Lipsett joined us in 1982, and when I became president of the national organization WAND, Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament, which also experienced a lot of growth, Brooke became president of NAND and continued the work here. WAND, then Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament, now still continues to this day, and I've placed a few brochures in the back. It's Women's Action for Nuclear Directions. It's not just for women, it's women, men, but it's led by women in leadership working on this issue. We experience unprecedented national growth with our organization. We grew from 1 to 45 states. We grew from little money to a $1.2 million annual budget. I attended the 1986 World Congress of Women in Moscow as one of 3,500 delegates to that conference to talk about nuclear weapons issues from 156 countries around the world. After 1986, Reagan, of course, had been reelected in '84. But then Gorbachev and all of those things happened. We saw the breakdown of the Berlin Wall, so we saw an erosion in support for the nuclear disarmament issue. People perceived it as okay, it was happening, not to worry. Let's think about the environment, let's think about the prison situation, let's think about the health issues, and on and on. So we saw a decline. WAND refocused to Women's Action for Nuclear Directions on the national level. WAND, Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament.
New directions.
New is now focused to new directions at that time. That's what I was trying to say. I apologize. And NAND basically in 1990 began to dissipate. There was not a big need for it. It put its energies, people that were still active in the peace movement, joined other organizations such as 2020 Vision, which is, I think, led at this point by Peter Smith and Lynn Holbein. And they continue, and it's, again, an action you can do to be a member of 2020. You get a monthly postcard about issues you can be involved in, as simple as, contacting your congressman and pay your $20 a year dues. So that happened. NAND, the local group, began to fade, and so the question becomes, so there went the 1990s. The peace movement didn't die. Many of the groups continued on. You remember probably the Sane Freeze group, besides one, the Council for a Livable World. A lot of them have continued. And the wonderful thing with technology today, because actually I went back as a consultant to do one work about 3 years ago before my Newton City job. My gosh, everyone's online and everyone's connected and everyone's doing, a lot of work online that we as the general public, we don't see it, and it's happening, and it's so hopeful, and it's there. So there is hope. There's a lot out there. It isn't like we're starting something all over. Sure, it's not publicized in the paper. It's not something you see every day, but it is there. So we would like to talk about some actions we can do now, because we're here today and the question is threatening us in terms of what does the future bring. There's a lot of things happening. In Newton was already mentioned that Newton Dialogues for Peace and War has sort of sprung up, concerned citizens coming together. Is Linda Nathanson here tonight? Linda, would you please stand up? This is Linda Nathanson, who's been pulling the Newton Dialogues for Peace and War together. Afterwards, please be sure you speak to her about the vigils that are held every Thursday in Newton Center from 5 to 6 p.m. Also, again, online, this group has tremendous access to actions that can be taken, things that can be done. I'm sure she has lots of information. Would be happy to have your name and number, email address to inform you of what's happening. Secondly, as I mentioned, 2020 is continuing to do its work. If you're interested in that, I've got the information here. Third, we mentioned Women's League for Peace and Freedom, and we honor that organization. Is Joan Eckline here tonight? Joan in the back, please stand up. Good to see you. Stand up and say hi. This is one of the longest peace organizations in this country. Joan can tell you about all kinds of actions, so be sure afterwards to speak to Joan about all kinds of actions that can be done. In terms of WAND, Helen Caldecott is coming back to Newton to talk about her new book, New Nuclear Danger, and she'll be here November 10th. And I've made little tiny mini flyers like a business card you can pick up at the back of the room and take with you to give you more information about this lecture, which will be coming up in early November. Another thing is that our great friend Lynn Holbein, who I don't think is here yet, is working for Council for a Livable World, and she's basically focused on, okay, let's fundraise and change the house. So Peace PAC fundraiser, Peace PAC meaning Political Action Committee, will be having a fundraiser in Newton on Sunday, October 20th. And the money from that will raise the funds to take back the house. It'll honor George McGovern. It will feature Father Robert Drynan. And for more information, if Lynn's not here, please come and see me about that. And lastly, or second to lastly, Brooke Lipsett, who's long been involved in these issues with Voice of Women and then NAND, has written a terrific open letter. We expect to see it published in the newspapers this week, probably the Tab and the Globe, from the elected officials taking a position about, approaching the UN to do its duty first before we launch into war. And what we've done is what Brooke's done is tailor the letter to us citizens. So in the back is a copy of the letter in a frame, and you can just sign. If you support this letter, you can just sign your name and be a supporter, so we can send that in to Kennedy, Kerry, Frank, etc., letting them know that there are many people out here who don't want to rush into war. We understand that we want to support the president and we want to work together, but at some point we need to know that it is not unpatriotic to say that we are concerned about war. And the last thing I would ask you to take an action and do is look in today's Globe and read James Carroll's op-ed piece, The President's Nuclear Threat. I think that gives you a good overview of the whole issue in a single article. And I close by just saying one thing, and because I've done a lot of work with Native American Indians, so I can't resist saying this. A Native American grandfather was talking to his grandson about how he felt about the tragedy that occurred September 11th, 2001. And the grandfather said to the grandson, "How do you feel about this terrorism?" And the grandson said, "I feel as if I have two wolves fighting in my heart. One wolf is vengeful, angry, and violent. The other wolf is loving and compassion." And the grandson asked his father, "Well, which wolf will win the fight?" And the grandfather replied, "The one you feed." Thank you.
Thank you, Bev. I guess we don't need to worry about whether the peace movement's alive and well, do we? Not with people like Bev around. Thank you so much. Before we turn to hearing from the authors of the book on the civil rights movement in Newton, I would like to call on Kathy Jones, who just by happenstance is one of those authors, to make a presentation.
I want everybody to know that these groups work very closely together. And as you know, when we prepared the book for the Newton 2000, they were only able to put a select few pages devoted to these two issues. And the city had the wisdom to publish these two volumes of the books in their entirety. But it's not that easy to do something like that. And in order to get that done, we were very fortunate to have someone very special working with us. And she's here this evening. And on behalf of both groups, I would like to present Lee Hatfield with these flowers.
Yeah.
And thank you very much. She showed the utmost patience with us. This was a long, long process, and she's the person who's responsible for the beautiful layout of the photographs, and she selected them, and she worked on editing of it, and we really, really appreciate everything that you do.
Thank you for your beautiful work, and thank you, Kathy, for beautiful flowers. And let us turn now to the history of the civil rights movement in Newton. I think to get a frame for where this long work started, I would ask Lily Jefferson to come up and tell us a little bit about what Newton was like in the middle of the last century, in the 1950s and 60s. Lily Jefferson.
Thank you. I come not as prepared as I wished tonight because we had an emergency that I had to take care of. Despite what I'm going to talk about a little bit is fair housing and the toll road and probably a little bit about NCDF. Despite the fact that there was a fair housing legislation in Massachusetts in 1957, there was still discrimination in the city of Newton for people of color who tried to buy a house. I remember very well as a young married couple that we went to different places, Newton at first, to look for a home, because that's where I had grown up, and I had brought my husband from Boston and said, we will live in Newton. But I did find that we lived in a place in Newton called the Village, which was adjacent to the Boston and Albany Railroad. And that's the place eventually where Mass Pike extended itself into Boston. We would go to places that they would say to us, unless you were of another persuasion, we cannot sell you a house. So when in 1957 discrimination existed in Newton, and only two realtors in the city at that time, Melvin Klein, who owned his own establishment, and Mary Rustin, who worked for Longwood Associates, were the two people who would sell housing. We found out that quite often a real estate would say he would meet you at a certain place, and he would park to see who came. And if a black face appeared, he never came to show us a house. To say that that was really, really very hard on people is to put it very mildly. I want to name a few of the people who were a part of that first Fair Housing Committee. We ran off mimeographs, we sent flyers to real estate people and whatnot. Some of Newton residents who were members of this multiracial, and I think that's the important word there, multiracial committee included Richard Scobie, Ed Hickey, Jerry Grossman, Ed Richmond, Helen Evans, Dr. Charles Bonner, William and Joyce Holman, and if you're in here when I say your name, just raise your hand. Helen Levine, Ellen Feingold, Hubie and Kathy Jones, George and Louise Hauser, Jacqueline and Lawrence Cook, Paul Dietz, Sam Turner, Nancy and Michael Mann, Nancy's here I know, Mary Takianki, Helen Levy, Eleanor Rosenblum, Arthur Lyman, Joyce and George Roberts, Dorothy Harper, and Charles and Ina Lawrence. Test cases revealed that prospective buyers of color often had to send what we would call a straw to see if a house was really available. Because we as blacks had been already and had been told that the house was no longer for sale or for rent. So the straw would go and come back and tell us, yes, the house is still open and they just don't want to sell it to you. We were active in Newton as a community activist, and my husband was the first black to become an elected official in the city of Newton. So that we were people who, and as many of my friends who were people who wanted to live in better housing or to find other housing. I moved from the village because there was not another house in quote the village that would take the size of the family we had at that time. But we are thankful for the people whose names I read and others whose names are not put on this list, that we did work and were able to have fair housing come to Newton. We used the model, I believe, that Natick had for Newton's fair housing, and it worked very well for us. I'll talk a little bit about the toll road. The toll road took 350 establishments in the city of Newton. 26 of those establishments were homes and stores in the vicinity of Myrtle Baptist Church. And I just want to stop here and say that a lot of the things that started in Newton started in Myrtle Baptist Church because people would come and we would meet together about the things that were not right for us as a city called Newton, in a place that was progressive and whatnot. So we really wanted to make it a better place. There were 26 units, as I said before, of houses and a store in this vicinity of Myrtle Baptist Church. Sims Court, Douglas Street, and Hicks Place were demolished. Those houses just are no longer available. And to know that the people were not probably going to be able to buy comparable housing in the city of Newton led us to take action. And the city of Newton was, I'm happy to say, part of giving the action that made it possible for some people to be able to buy housing in cities. Lester Houston was hired by the city for that purpose, to make sure that we could excuse me, I do have a cold.
Lily, there's some water underneath.
Oh, thank you. And that allowed people to get get monies for the houses they sold. In fact, first of all, they wanted to demolish the houses. Before they wanted to do that, they wanted to move those houses from where they were to, if any of you know where Myrtle Baptist Church is, in the little playground area between that and the Boston and Albany. They had this plan that they wanted to move en masse those houses into that area. But thanks to Newton's ability in hiring people to help with that. That did not happen. And we found that most people were able, those who were not afraid to wait, because that was a terrifying piece, because if you waited, you didn't know what was going to happen. But most of the people who did and were displaced found housing in Newton, Natick, Medford, and other places near there. The majority of them were able to find housing in Newton. One day my telephone rang, and I picked up the phone, and someone said to me, "There's a family named so-and-so who wants to move next door to me. What do you think? Should I let them come?" And I, hopefully very nicely, told them that that was not my job. Their job was to do the thing that was right, and they knew what would benefit them in the long run, because I found that most people became close friends. And this thing about what color you were or wherever you came from really did not matter at all. One of the biggest fights and disappointments, I think, to me in Newton was when NCDF disclosed that it was going to build 50 units of housing. And that kind of tore the city all apart. I think it was at Newton North High School that we had this meeting. And people who had been your next door neighbors and you thought were your good friends were the people who stood up and said, "We don't want those 50 units because we are afraid that basically the people who will use those units will be blacks from out of the inner city." And so, as we all know, NCDF was only able at that time to build the hamlet. And that took a lot of hard work and fortitude for them to go forward and to do that. So, and I think Eloise Holden, I don't know whether Eloise is in the room or not. Hi, Eloise. Eloise is the one Eloise does not give up easily, and she's still not giving up easily. So that, and the ministers who came forward to be a part of that also are to be commended, because a lot of ministers, even in schooling, and when they brought Metco children into some areas, those ministers who stood up for those people were left there. They had to leave their pulpits because their parishioners would no longer want them. Reverend Tom Lehman of Grace Episcopal Church was the leader of that for a while, and there were Rabbi Mary Rothman and several other ministers at the time helped us to be able to at least have that beginning with the hamlet and go on to the other areas and places that NCDF has been able to do. Right now, I think that we still have work to do. It's not finished yet. So I ask you, as good friends and good neighbors, to talk to your friends who probably think a little differently than you, to say that the city is a better place because of what has happened. Thank you.